Hi everyone, I'm Michael Hawker, also known as the XAML Llama, thus the Hat, and today we're here to build Windows applications. So welcome to build your first Windows application with WinUI and Visual Studio. Today we're going to cover and introduce how to get started with Windows development with C# and Visual Studio, getting up your project started. Going over a little bit more about what XAML is, how to find the tools and things you need to get started there. Cover the MVVM pattern in brief, so we'll get more about what that is in a bit. And then end with some debugging tools specific to Windows development that you may need on your journey. So you'll have all the tools you need today to build great Windows experiences. So let's dive in. All right, so where do we get started on our journey? The best place to go is https://aka.ms/windev, W-I-N-D-E-V, and that's going to take you to this portal for Windows development. And we start off here at the top, which with what we're talking about today is WinUI, and so this really shows you all the great things that you can do with WinUI and why it's a good framework to choose for native Windows development. You get all the modern, slick, accessible UI. You can build with C# or C++. Today we're going to be talking about C# in this video. It's also being optimized for running on the latest Windows hardware, and it's part of the Windows App SDK. So there's a lot of great modern new APIs that are coming to the Windows App SDK, such as the new AI APIs. And so once we get you started here today, you'll have a great toolbox to go investigate about how to build a great native Windows experience. And so I can just click on the Get Started with WinUI here, and this is going to take us to a tutorial and talk about how we can get started with Windows App development, and this is going to be part of what I'm following here at the start today. First step here is to enable developer mode on our machine. So if you go into settings under system, you can scroll down and find for developer in this list here. It's right here with the little wrench and screwdriver. And so if I click in there, then we can just turn on developer mode here. You can see I've already got that on. So once you've got that all set up, you are ready for Windows development and to get started with Visual Studio. So let's go into the Visual Studio installer. I've, of course, already got Visual Studio installed, so I'm going to click Modify. The workload here that we want is the WinUI application development. You can see that I've already got that checked, so you're just going to want to check this box. If you are doing C++ development, you'll want to check this additional box over here on the right. That'll check a few more things. Today we're just going to be going through with C#, and so I can install that and be all set to go there. And now we're ready to go into Visual Studio. So I'm using the preview of Visual Studio today just because it has some slightly newer updates to the Windows template, but you'll still be able to follow along just as easily with the existing template, and it'll be coming to stable soon. So I'm just going to create a new project, and I can use the drop-down up in the top right here to select WinUI, as I've done. And if you're familiar with .NET development, probably some of these templates seem familiar, like a unit test application or a class library. We're going to select the WinUI blank app packaged up here at the top, and this just creates a simple single project Windows app for you. Let me name it my first WinUI app. And I have all the familiar settings of choosing where the project's going to be, or if I want the solution and the project in the same directory. Visual Studio is now going to go create this project for me. Great. And so over here on the right, we have the Solution Explorer. If you can't find it, you can use the feature search to quickly find whatever you need or whatever I'm talking about in today's video, if it's not exactly the same as what you see on the screen here today. And there's a few files in our WinUI project, so I'm not going to talk too much about these two manifest files. These become more important once you have an application built and looking to deploy it. Or for instance, maybe you want to publish it to the Microsoft Store, or maybe you want to build a single exe application and distribute that traditional kind of method. So that's kind of beyond the scope of just getting started here, but those are kind of what those files are for and what's related to them. The main ones we care about today are the app.xaml and, more importantly, the main window.xaml. So these are our starting points, and you want to note that you can actually expand these. And so for every XAML file, there's a C# file usually that backs it, and you'll see those collapsed here together in the UI. And the app.xaml, this holds a whole bunch of resources that are kind of shared across your whole application. I'm not going to go into this too much today, but that's where these things live. And there's some other videos I'll point out that we'll cover that stuff in more detail. The app.xaml.cs file is actually the entry point for your application. So you can see this onLaunched method. This is where we get arguments, parameters about how our application was decided to open. If someone like dragged a file onto it in Explorer or something, you'll get those types of parameters here. And you can see it's creating the main window, right? And that's going to be the main display within our application. And the main window CS file is just initializing our XAML component here. And so we need to talk about what XAML is and all this stuff. But let's just run this here with the play button up at the top. You can just click on that. And we'll see what this looks like, right? There's not too much here. We just have an empty grid, so we're not going to expect much. But this validates that we've got everything in Visual Studio and all the dependencies we need to start building a Windows app. And voila, we have a Windows app. You can see there's not much in it because we just have an empty grid over here. We also do get this new Mica backdrop. And if I minimize here and go back to my desktop, you can see I have this blue desktop, and there's this very faint kind of bluish hue on the background of my app that stays aligned with where my background is. That's what the Mica material does. And really part of the power of building a Windows native app is getting access to these performant effects. So I'm going to close that, go back to Visual Studio here, and let's talk about XAML. And how do we learn about what's going on here? And so a great resource for some of this, if you want to dig into more about learning about what we just talked about with the app and main window, is the Windows Developer YouTube channel. So that's youtube.com/Windows Developers. And so we have a whole section here on WinUI videos. And I had actually a video here that talks all about app organization in XAML and about main window, app, all those sorts of different constructs. And so be good future follow-up once you get familiar with the development techniques we're talking about here. As well as other videos from like .NET Conf in the past. Later in the video, we'll talk about MVVM. So this is a great video over here too for that. So we've just shown you how to get started with Visual Studio, install the workload, just one click, super simple, and get started building your app and seeing some results, right? But we've been talking about a lot of these different concepts like XAML, and so what is it? How do we get started? And how do we kind of learn more about this? And for that, there's actually some great applications in the Microsoft Store that can show us every building block that we have access to and help us easily copy that into Visual Studio to get started. So this is the tip that you want to know. So I'm going to actually open Command Palette from the PowerToys tools. Really cool stuff. It actually has a Winget extension. And so I can search in Winget for WinUI. And the top results here are going to be the WinUI gallery. So I want the WinUI 3 gallery. You can actually see that I've already installed it here. And it's from the Microsoft Store. And so I can just hit Enter, install that, and then I can search for Toolkit. And we have a variety of community toolkits that are maintained by Microsoft and the community in open source under the .NET Foundation. And so there's a couple applications there, such as the Windows Community Toolkit, as well as the MVVM Toolkit. And so definitely good to install these two as well. And we'll cover about more of these in a minute. So I can just search for WinUI now in Command Palette and open up the WinUI gallery. And this gallery is basically the whole menu of what's available to do within WinUI. You can actually see that it calls out the community toolkit here as well. And so if let's say, want to add a checkbox to my application, I can look over here in basic input, I could search, and here's this checkbox. And this gives me links to the documentation and the source to these samples, as well as these interactive examples that show me how to use this control. And I can even expand the source code here and see this XAML here that I can copy with this button over here. And so I'm just going to do that. I'm going to copy this checkbox. I want to add a checkbox to my app. So now I can go into Visual Studio and paste that in. Maybe I only want one of the events for the checked method, so I can delete that extra event. And now when I'm over the event name here, this two-state check that it filled in, I can actually hit F12, and Visual Studio will generate this method for me. And let's make sure that it's working. I want to maybe add some output just so I can see that, yep, I've hit this method. I don't know what it's going to do yet. So I can use debug and do .WriteLine. You can see it's filling it in here with IntelliSense. I can use the light bulb to add the namespace. And so I've got this debug.writeLine, and I could also just do this with a breakpoint and select actions here from the menu. And this lets me actually output, not actually just break with a breakpoint, but actually output some information to my debugger as well. So I can just say main window initialized. So now we have a couple of different ways that we can kind of output information and see what's going on within our app. So I'm just going to run this again. And you can see I've already got the output window here. And if I don't have that, then I can find that under the debug Windows output menu here. And we can already see that I've hit that action breakpoint and see that main window initialized there. And if I open up the application and check the checkbox, we can see that that event is triggered as well. So just a couple quick, easy tips on how to get started with debugging these things, because a lot of times with Windows and UI development, stuff is going on, or one action triggers another, and it's not always easy to capture, putting a breakpoint in VS, because sometimes that stops the flow of what your UI is trying to do and doesn't exhibit the same behavior, right? So with either using the debug.writeLine or adding a breakpoint live while you're using your app and using actions, you can get information printed out to the console, which can kind of help you as good early easy tips for debugging. All right, so we've added something that's built into WinUI. I also mentioned these community toolkits. So they provide a lot of other experiences that maybe not every application needs, but that a large majority of them use, or at least in different pieces. You can also open the Windows Community Toolkit gallery and see even more controls that are available to you as a WinUI developer. So let me do that now. I'll use Command Palette again here and just search for Toolkit, and I have the Windows Community Toolkit gallery. And this looks very familiar to the WinUI gallery, so if you're getting comfortable using that, you'll be at home here. You may have noticed in a lot of application on Windows, they have these great rich settings pages, just like we saw in the settings app earlier. And so we actually have a control for that as well. We have two of them, the settings card and settings expander in the Windows Community Toolkit gallery as well. And so you can see these rich different options we have, and we can get the source code here as well to help us add this to our application. First thing we need to know is the package information. So these are available as extra components in NuGet packages. All the code for this is actually open source, so you can see the source code for the actual components here as well. But we can see this is in the community toolkit.winui.controls .settings controls package. So let's talk about NuGet packages in Visual Studio. So to get to NuGet packages, I'm going to right-click on my project and go down to Manage NuGet Packages. And NuGet packages are just these extra libraries and components that I can pull into my app. A lot of them are open source. You really need to look at the details and understand what you're installing. So I'm going to go to the Browse tab here. And I'm going to search for that package. So that was community toolkit.winui.controls.settings something. And here I see the WinUI settings controls. And so that's what I want here. And I'm just going to click on install. It's going to tell me what other dependencies this package needs, and then tell me about all the open source licenses or other types of licenses that this package has, those packages have in them. And so that's going to get my package installed. We can see the little green check mark. All right, so now that we've installed that package, we can do the same sort of technique that we did for the WinUI gallery with the Windows Community Toolkit gallery, right? We can find an example of settings card here, right? Here's one with a combo box. So I'm just going to copy this out here and paste that into my main window. Right, and I don't need a icon right now or this other property. And let's replace our combo box with a button that just has some content that says, click here. And then you can see we get some squigglies, so it doesn't know what this controls namespace is. We can use the light bulb here and add the XML and S to the community toolkit.winui controls. And so this is a line that just tells the XAML where to find these components in that NuGet dependency that we installed here. And so now if we run this, we should be able to see our settings card in action. Great, there it is. We could add some extra padding or margin to this control as well if we wanted, but we have our basic steps of a settings control. So now we want to hook some logic into it, add some sort of data to our application. And so that's where we need to talk about MVVM. So let's talk about that next. So now that we have our settings card in place, I'm going to open up the MVVM Toolkit sample app and talk a little bit about MVVM. So MVVM stands for Model, View, View Model. And if you've come from the web world of development and maybe used Angular or React or Vue, some of these concepts we've been showing with XAML and might kind of be an analog to HTML. And what this pattern is really similar to those types of models you see on the web, where you're trying to connect and separate your data and your application's logic from the presentation of that data. And that's exactly what MVVM is around. You have your model, which is the data layer. You have the view model, which contains your application logic and how to manipulate that data. And then you have the view, which is all of the XAML and pieces specific to Windows that's on top there. And the MVVM toolkit is just a great, simple way to use exactly what you need, regardless of which UI framework you're using. So today we're talking about WinUI, but this works for WPF, UWP, for Uno platform, Avalonia, Maui, whatever you happen to be using in the .NET ecosystem, the MVVM toolkit probably has something for you. And so there's a lot of implied patterns with Windows development and WinUI that are in .NET, and the MVVM toolkit provides implementations all for these. So I'm not going to go into detail about everything here. We're going to make use of source generators and these attributes to really cut down on the boilerplate and just have the library do this implementation of iNotify property changed for us. This is the interface in .NET that tells data has changed and notifies the XAML layer in your WinUI app that it needs to refresh and display that data. And that's how it can be performant and efficient and save battery, because it doesn't have to update and display things constantly. It knows when things are getting updated behind the scenes. So let's go back to Visual Studio. We're going to add another dependency through NuGet here. And I'm just going to search for Community Toolkit MVVM. And at the top of the list here, we see Community Toolkit MVVM. So I can just install that as well with the little arrow here and accept the dialogues. And we'll have this MVVM toolkit now. So I can right click, I'm going to go add a new class. I'm going to call this main view model. And I can use file scope namespaces with a semicolon if I want. I'm going to change this to be public. And since we're using source generators, I want to make sure that this class is marked as partial as well. And then I'm going to inherit from observable object. And so this is the, and then use the light bulb, of course, to add the namespace. And so this is the base class in the MVVM toolkit, which contains all this rich logic to notify the UI, does a whole bunch of optimizations for efficiency. It's just does all that work for us. And then I'm going to create a property. I'm going to make it partial as well. And let's just call it count. And then I'm going to declare it with this observable property attribute. And you can see I'm getting a couple of squigglies here. The MVVM toolkit is using the latest and greatest stuff from .NET in language version that shipped in .NET 9, as well as some preview features in .NET 10. So if you're already using .NET 10, if that's come out yet, then you don't need to worry about this step. In this case, I'm just going to click on my project. It's telling me I need to use a newer language version for C#. So I'm just going to add the lang version property here and set that to preview. If you're, again, on .NET 10, you don't need to worry about that. And voila, the squigglies go away. We can even see I'm getting some assistance here of like incrementing the count with a method. So great, we want that as well. And so what this attribute does is just quickly generate all the boilerplate code that's going to notify our XAML layer about what's going on. If you actually want to see the code that it's generating, you can go over to Dependencies and Analyzers over here on the right underneath your project and dig into the MVVM source generators. And down at the bottom, you can see the observable property generator. And you can see our main view model. And so this is kind of useful if you're using any source generators to look into this, but this is all the boilerplate code about notifying the UI and giving you all these different efficient hooks into this system if you care about it. But that's more detail than we need to go into today. So the last thing we might want to do, right, is call this incrementCount method, right? And so for that, we're going to just add this other attribute called relay command. That'll generate some other code for us as well. And these are kind of the main things you're going to do with MVVM. Is you're going to have observable properties that encapsulate your data and notify the UI that something's changed, and relay commands to call back into your methods here to act on that data. You can see we're getting some other suggestions for other methods. I'm not going to worry about those at the moment. So how do we hook this into our XAML? So let's flip back over to our main window. I'm actually going to go to the code behind in the main window.xaml.cs first. And I want to actually instantiate our view model here so that we can use it. So I'm going to go say public main view model. I'm just going to call it view model. Make this a property as well. And I'm just going to initialize it there easily. And so now we can use this in our XAML with something called xbind. And xbind is some markup that's going to allow us to hook in our data to our XAML here. So for instance, maybe I want the description of my settings card to show the count. So I can use x:bind in these curly braces. And then I can access my view model. And you can see I'm getting IntelliSense here and even have access to our count. And then I'm going to add a comma and add this mode parameter and set it to one way. And what this mode parameter does is say how we want to bind. And so by default, xbind is only going to bind once, and so then it'll never update. And in this case, this is our data. This is what we're updating. So we want to use the one way here to update that. You can even see I'm getting the suggestion already to add the command to our incrementCount command. So I'm going to just hit tab over here to add that here. And here we don't need to use one-way binding because the command is never changing. We're never changing what method we're calling. So we can just do that once. So now with this stuff in place, we can talk a little bit more about debugging and how to dig into what happens with Windows apps. So let me get this started here, and we can talk a little bit more about some of these Visual Studio tools that can help us understand what's going on here. So we have our application now. We have our settings card. We have our counter over here is at 0. And then we have our button. So if I click my button, we can see with that command, it's calling into our view model. It's incrementing our counter. And with that one-way binding, we're seeing this value update in the UI. Great, it works, huzzah! We now have a working Windows app. But what happens if something goes wrong, right? How can we understand more about what's happening behind the scenes here? And so you may have noticed at the top here, we have this toolbar. This is where all these XAML debugging tools live. And so one of the first ones you'll probably use is this one, which lets you select an element within your UI. You also have the ability to kind of see its boundary, as well as track if you are changing things from elsewhere along where that is in your UI. And what's called the visual tree. The visual tree represents the XAML structure that's displayed within your application. So it's really one of the most powerful tools you have access to as a Windows developer here. And so I'm going to select an element. I can select for instance, like this button that we've added. You can see it can select the settings card itself or the button. If I click there, you notice something happened in Visual Studio over here. I can actually use the button here, go to Live Visual Tree. That brings up this panel here. And you can see that I've got my grid, my settings card, my button. And, this looks very familiar. And if I click on the little button, let's say next to the settings card here, then that actually highlights and shows me where that XAML is in my main window as well. So you can kind of see the corollary here. One of the things with XAML about why it's so powerful is that there's a lot of stuff happening behind the scenes. Like this settings card is not just a settings card. It's made up of many other different components. And so another button to be aware of is the Show My XAML button here. And so by default it's on. So if I unclick that, untoggle that, then you can see there's a whole bunch of other components in XAML that are making up this settings card and containing these different elements. And you can see now that I'm getting more fine-grained selection over here in this XAML Live Preview. And so this is a whole other window that's really helpful, is that it's like without even my application on screen, just in Visual Studio here, I can kind of see what's going on within my app. So let's go back over to our visual tree, and I've got that text block here. I can actually right-click on it, and I can go Show Properties. This brings up the Live Property Explorer and shows me all the different properties that are set within this, including the text. And you can see it's set to a binding and has this evaluated value of 13. So now if I go back into my application and I click the button a few times, and then I click on Refresh, I can actually see that value is updated here as well. So this is a great way to kind of introspect and look at different things that are going on within your application. And if you're not sure exactly how something's built, you can turn off the Just My XAML. You can dig into that specific component and maybe find out a little bit more about how things are set or how it's bound and what might be happening there. And with this XAML Live Preview window, we can actually make changes to our application here, right? So if I wanted to, say, this is maybe number of times button pressed, and then call the button IncrementCount. Then you can see already I've made the changes over here to my XAML and see that live within the live preview. So it gives us this great hot reload scenario here in Visual Studio while we're developing our app to really kind of bootstrap our development process. And so with that, I think we've covered everything you need to know about Windows development in Visual Studio. There's a lot of different pieces here, but hopefully you have all the tools in your toolbox now to know where to grab different components, all the components available to you, all these different patterns and ways to organize your application, your code to set you up for success, as well as how to debug and figure out how to go and find out when things aren't quite going right, how to get yourself out of those problems. And so be sure to check out our Windows Developers YouTube channel as well. We have a lot of great videos here about organization, for MVVM, for XAML, for styles and resources, all these different things that you can start digging into and learn how to build great experiences on Windows with WinUI. And so we're really happy to have had you join us here today. Appreciate you watching this video. And let us know what you build. We're really excited to see what happens and what you build with our tools. Thanks so much.